Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. Waking from emergency surgery, I found the chair beside my bed completely empty. My parents have flown to Cancun with my brother, treating the hospital like an inconvenient layover. 7 days later, my mother arrived with a fresh tan, expecting our usual dynamic to resume. Then she saw the visitor log. One name appeared every single night. That midnight visitor was not just checking on me. She came to expose the secret that had funded my family for years. My name is Scarlett Rivera. I am 33 years old, living in the sprawling sun-baked suburbs of Scottsdale, Arizona. By day, I am the compliance and payroll manager at Gray Haven Transit Systems. By night, on weekends, and during every supposed lunch break, I am the designated cleanup crew for my family. I am the kind of woman both my corporate employer and my blood relatives simply assume will sweep up the shattered glass of everyone else's poor choices. I do not stand out in a loud, charismatic, attention-grabbing way. Instead, I stand out because I am chronically, desperately reliable. I am the one who remembers the exact date the property tax is due. I know precisely which bureaucratic form needs to be filed by 5 in the afternoon, the exact customer service number to dial to waive a late fee, and the specific sequence of soothing words required to keep the walls from caving in on the people around me. In the Rivera household, survival relies on a deeply ingrained, unspoken division of labor. My father, Martin Rivera, is a man who wields silence like a weapon of mass emotional destruction. He never asks for money or help directly. Instead, he stops talking. He lets a heavy, suffocating aura of disappointment fill the living room. Sitting in the dark, staring at a stack of final notices, he waits, letting the tension escalate until someone else rushes in to solve the problem just to make the punishing quiet stop. That someone else is always me. My mother, Elena Rivera, employs a completely different tactic. She uses a voice as smooth and delicate as silk, wrapping her endless financial demands in thick layers of maternal guilt until they feel like unshakable moral obligations. She will call me at 2 in the afternoon on a busy Tuesday, sighing softly into the receiver, and say things like how family takes care of family and how she would never ask if it were not an absolute emergency. In her world, it is always an emergency, and my bank account is always the designated shelter. And then there is my younger brother, Jace. Jace is 30 years old, possessing the kind of effortless golden boy charm that makes strangers want to hand him free drinks and second chances. He is highly articulate, perpetually energized, and currently branding himself as a luxury travel content creator. If you ask him, he is always just one viral video away from blowing up. He spends his days curating an aesthetic fantasy, posting carefully filtered photos from beachside cabanas, infinity pools, and boutique hotel lobbies. What his thousands of followers do not see is the invisible, exhausted scaffolding holding that entire digital life up. That scaffolding is me. Much of his high-end lifestyle is quietly underwritten by my modest salary and my panicked, last-minute crisis management skills within our family ecosystem. Jace represents boundless potential. I, on the other hand, represent stark reliability. Those two labels carry vastly different rules of engagement. Jace is constantly forgiven for his missed deadlines, his overdrawn checking accounts, and his wildly unrealistic business proposals because he is a visionary who dares to dream big. The world is supposedly just too small and unaccommodating for his artistic ambitions. I am expected to sacrifice my time, my savings, and my peace of mind without a single complaint because I am competent enough to endure the burden. Competence in my family is not rewarded with respect. It is punished with more work. Jace gets to be the soaring kite, and I am the dirt-stained string keeping him tethered to the earth. Over the past several years, my role evolved from an occasional helping hand to a full-time financial safety net. It started with small things, the kind of things any good daughter would do. I would pay the electric bill during a month when my parents were supposedly tight on cash. I would cover the emergency plumber call when the kitchen sink backed up, or quietly pay the pharmacy co-I for my father's blood pressure medication so he would not have an excuse to skip his doses. But small favors have an insidious way of breeding massive entitlement. Soon I was untangling complicated state tax audits from years my father simply forgot to file. I was paying off high-interest credit card debt that my mother racked up buying furniture to keep up appearances. Most frequently, I was transferring what were always framed as temporary bridge loans to Jace. These loans were never ever repaid. Mentioning them only invited my mother's silky reprimands about my cynical nature and my lack of faith in my brother's creative vision. I am a logical person, or at least I try very hard to be. For a long, exhausting time, I managed to convince myself that this was simply a difficult temporary phase of life. I told myself that this is what being a responsible adult truly means. You should the heavy, unglamorous burden so the people you love most do not have to suffer. I rationalized that familial love in its rawest and most practical form sometimes looks indistinguishable from outright financial and emotional exploitation. I believed that eventually the tide would turn. The investments in Jay's career would pay off. My parents would find their footing, and my family would look back with deep gratitude and recognize the solid foundation I had bled to build for them. I thought I was buying their security. In reality, I was just funding my own gradual eraser. But the human body does not care about logical rationalizations or familial duty. You can lie to your own mind for decades, but your organs keep the score. The physical signals of betrayal began quietly, mirroring the quiet, insidious way my family took from me. It started as a dull, throbbing ache in my upper abdomen, a heavy, hot sensation that settled right under my ribs and refused to leave. I dismissed it as routine indigestion. Then came the severe stress nourser, waking me up at 3:00 or 4 in the morning with a throat full of burning acid and a heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stopped eating real meals. The thought of solid food made my stomach twist in violent knots. My daily diet devolved into cups of bitter black coffee to keep my eyes open through double shifts of payroll reconciliation and compliance auditing. A giant half-empty bottle of chalky antacids took up permanent residence in the top drawer of my office desk. The pills rattled against the plastic every time I reached for a pen or a stapler, serving as a constant, mocking soundtrack to my physical decline. I began losing weight, my clothes hanging off my frame in a way that my mother actually praised over the phone as a successful new diet. The most terrifying symptom, however, was the sudden, overwhelming dizzy spells. There were moments when I would stand up from my office chair too quickly, and the entire room would go completely black. The edges of my vision would blur into nothingness. A high-pitched ringing would fill my ears, and all the strength would instantly drain from my legs. I would have to grip the hard edge of my desk with white knuckles, digging my fingernails into the wood just to keep from collapsing onto the carpet. I would stand there paralyzed in the dark, waiting for the world to slowly come back into focus, taking shallow, ragged breaths. Once the darkness cleared and the ringing faded, I would sit back down, open another spreadsheet, pop another antacid, and go right back to work. Because the quarterly payroll had to be submitted, the compliance forms had to be filed, and the Rivera family required their monthly subsidies. I did not have the time or the permission to be sick. I was the reliable one. And the reliable one does not get to fall apart even when her body is screaming for her to stop. The shift in their extraction methods did not happen overnight. It was a slow, insidious creep, transitioning seamlessly from demands for hard cash to a far more dangerous hunger for my administrative identity. They stopped asking for physical bills to be paid and started asking for my name. My mother perfected the art of the preemptive guilt trip, weaving manipulation into everyday domesticity. She would wait until I was exhausted from my commute, corner me near the refrigerator, and slide a manila folder across the cold granite of the kitchen island. Her eyes would widen soft and apologetic, masking the absolute command in her voice. "I hate to ask you to do this, Scarlett," she would murmur, her tone dripping with a carefully rehearsed artificial regret. "But you are the only one in this house with a head for paperwork. If I do it, I will just mess up the numbers, and then we will be in real trouble." It was a floorless trap. If I sighed, if I let my shoulders slump, if I hesitated for even a fraction of a second to take the folder, I was instantly cast as the cold, ungrateful daughter withholding her God-given organizational talents from the fragile mother who raised her. My father was less poetic, but equally effective in his weaponized incompetence. He never bothered with apologies or soft tones. He would simply march into the dining room and drop thick, intimidating stacks of mortgage refinancing applications, complex annual tax declarations, and convoluted home insurance renewals directly onto my placemat. "I do not understand any of these things," he would grunt, turning his back and walking toward the garage before the papers even settled on the table. He never asked if I had the time. He just left them there, a ticking administrative bomb. He knew my anxiety would never allow me to let a severe legal deadline pass. So I would spend my weekends filling out every single line, checking every mandatory box, and signing exactly where they told me they needed a witness or a secondary emergency contact. Then there was Jace. While my parents dealt in the grim reality of survival, my brother dealt in aggressive, brightly colored delusions of grandeur. Every few months he would burst through the front door, buzzing with manic energy, carrying a new, dazzling opportunity that was absolutely guaranteed to make us all wealthy beyond imagination. There was the pitch for a brand ambassador campaign in Tulum that required upfront capital for wardrobe. There was the exclusive luxury travel partnership that needed a massive joining fee. And, most persistently, there was the pre-construction condominium in Cancun. He paced the living room, waving the glossy brochure printed on heavy card stock. He claimed the Cancun property only needed a modest reservation deposit to lock in a massive life-changing return on investment. He pitched these schemes with the fervor of an evangelist, speaking as though inevitable, generational wealth was floating just above our heads. According to Jace, all we had to do to secure our legacy was reach up and grab it, provided we knew how to invest in the future. The unspoken catch, of course, was that reaching up required my pristine credit history and my verifiable income. I am not stupid. I outright refused to fund the vague, glittering mirages Jace presented. I told him absolutely no on the Tulum campaign. I drew a hard line and told him no on the Cancun reservation deposit. But family manipulation acts like water. If it cannot crash forcefully through the front door, it quietly seeps through the invisible cracks in the foundation. I stood my ground on the big investments. Yet, I found myself pulled into the undertow through 1,000 tiny, seemingly harmless administrative favors. Jace needed me to verify his erratic freelance income for a third-party vendor. He needed me to print out his obscure tax documents because his printer was always out of ink. He needed me to convert and transfer secure password-protected files, or just look over a promotional contract to make sure the legal jargon was sound. "Just look it over to be sure, Scarlett," he would say, flashing that golden boy smile. I justified every single concession. I told myself I was acting as his shield, protecting my foolish younger brother from predatory contracts. I never stopped to calculate the cumulative damage until much later. Over the course of 6 incredibly long, grueling years, the total amount of money I had quietly pumped into the Rivera household exceeded $110,000. That number alone should have been enough to make me pack my bags and sever all ties. It represented skipped vacations, canceled dental appointments, and years of wearing the same 3 professional suits to the office. Yet, the money was not the most terrifying part of the equation. The true hidden danger lay in the sheer volume of personal financial data my parents and brother had amassed from all those times I helped out just a little bit. By simply being the family manager, I had handed them the keys to my identity. They had my social security number memorized. They possessed digital and physical copies of my payabs, my bank routing numbers, my previous addresses, and crystal clear scans of my electronic signature. To my mother, my flawless credit score and my stable corporate salary were no longer my personal hard-earned achievements. They had mutated into a communal well. She began speaking about my finances with a chilling, absolute sense of ownership. Whenever I tried to establish a boundary or suggest they downsize their spending, she would wave a dismissive, manicured hand. "We are a family, Scarlett," she would say, pouring herself a generous glass of red wine. "One roof, one future. Everything we do is for the collective good." It was a beautiful, heartwarming slogan, perfectly designed to mask a parasitic reality. Deep down, a primal instinct warned me that something was profoundly, dangerously wrong. I remember walking into the kitchen late one Tuesday evening to grab a glass of ice water. My mother and Jace were huddled closely over the kitchen island, staring intently at a laptop screen, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The second my foot hit the linoleum floor, they snapped their mouths shut. The sudden silence was thick, heavy, and undeniably guilty. Jace quickly slammed the laptop shut and slid it behind his elbow. My mother instantly offered a smile so brittle and forced it could have shattered right there on the floor tiles. I stood there by the refrigerator, the cold water glass sweating against my palm, staring at them. My brain screamed at me to step forward, to demand they open the laptop, to ask exactly what they were hiding in the dark. But my body was entirely, utterly depleted. I was so profoundly exhausted from fighting the daily fires at work and at home that the thought of igniting a new massive war right there in the kitchen was physically unbearable. I actively chose to turn off my intuition. I grabbed my water, turned around, and walked slowly back to my bedroom, choosing a fragile, temporary peace over an ugly, demanding truth. Now that willful ignorance was coming to collect its heavy dues. The Cancun trip, the very one Jace insisted was going to be the ultimate turning point for his entire career, was finalized. He paraded around the house all week, loudly bragging about the pristine beaches, the elite networking opportunities, and the exclusive view from the property he was scouting. Meanwhile, I was not packing a suitcase for a tropical getaway. I was sitting under the harsh buzzing fluorescent lights of the Transit Authority office at 9:00 at night. The building was completely empty, echoing with the sound of my frantic typing. I was desperately trying to finalize the quarterly payroll reports before the midnight deadline. My stomach was a boiling cauldron of pure agony. The ulcer I did not yet know was tearing a hole inside me was screaming for attention. I gripped the hard plastic edge of my desk, my knuckles turning completely white, staring blankly at the glowing spreadsheet on my monitor. The pain radiating through my abdomen was so sharp, so blindingly intense, that the numbers on the screen began to blur. I had to close my eyes, clench my jaw, and physically force myself to take slow, shallow, measured breaths just to bridge the gap between sending one email and drafting the next. My brother was gleefully preparing for a lavish Mexican paradise built on a foundation of lies. And I was sitting in an empty office, simply trying to survive the next 10 seconds without collapsing onto the carpet. It happened on a crisp Thursday morning for nearly 2 weeks. My daily survival had depended entirely on a punishing regimen of lukewarm black coffee, dry saltine crackers, and handfuls of chalky and tacit tablets. I was sitting at my office desk, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, meticulously hunting down a discrepancy in the quarterly payroll report. I was trying to balance the numbers, trying to keep everything perfectly aligned, just as I always did. Then, without any warning, the pain struck. This was not the familiar dull ache I had grown accustomed to ignoring. This felt as though someone had taken a jagged, heated blade, shoved it directly under my ribs, and violently twisted the handle. I gasped, my fingers involuntarily releasing my mouse. A cold sweat instantly coated my forehead. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of my desk, trying to ride out the spasm. I told myself I just needed to walk to the restroom, splash some cold water on my face, and take another pill. I pushed my ergonomic chair back and forced my trembling legs to straighten. The exact moment I stood fully upright, gravity ceased to function correctly. A hot, thick, distinctly metallic liquid surged fiercely up the back of my throat. I clamped my hand over my mouth, but the dark, startling crimson of the spilled paint slipped between my fingers, dripping onto the pristine front of my white blouse. My ears were suddenly filled with a deafening high-pitched roar, entirely drowning out the ambient hum of the transit office. The strength simply vanished from my knees. I felt no impact, only a sudden violent shift in perspective as the ceiling rushed away, and I collapsed completely onto the thin gray industrial carpet of the main hallway. The moments that followed did not register as a continuous reality. They came to me in fragmented, distorted waves, filtering through what felt like a thick, impenetrable wall of dark water. I could not move my arms. I could not draw a full breath. I saw the blurred, panicked faces of my colleagues hovering over me. I heard a muffled, frantic voice screaming my name over and over. I felt the rough texture of paper towels being pressed hard against my chin and neck, attempting to stem the bleeding. Through the roaring in my ears, I heard the distinct, terrified command for someone to dial 911 immediately. Then a hand reached into my blazer pocket. I heard someone shout that they had bypassed my lock screen and were dialing the emergency contact labeled Mom. After that, the watery wall closed over my head completely, dragging me down into a deep, silent blackness. When consciousness finally returned, it brought a suffocating, sterile smell and the relentless synthetic beeping of a heart monitor. I opened my eyes to a blinding white ceiling. My throat felt scraped and raw, and a heavy throbbing agony radiated from the absolute center of my abdomen. I was tethered to a wall of machines by a chaotic web of clear plastic tubing. A grim, exhausted-looking surgeon stood beside my bed, holding a metal clipboard. He did not mince his words. He explained in stark and clinical terminology that I had suffered a perforated stomach ulcer accompanied by severe, life-threatening internal bleeding. My stomach lining had literally torn itself open. He leaned in, his eyes locking onto mine, and made it abundantly clear that an injury of this specific magnitude does not simply happen overnight. It was the catastrophic, inevitable result of many months of chronic stress, severe malnutrition, and a body pushed entirely past the limits of human endurance. My body had finally gone on strike. I drifted back into a heavy chemically induced sleep, only to be awakened hours later by the sound of voices drifting from the nurse's station just outside my open door. It was my mother and father. I lay completely still, keeping my eyes closed, too weak and too afraid to brace myself for their emotional reaction. I expected tears. I expected the frantic, terrified rush of parents who had just been told their daughter nearly bled to death on an office floor. Instead, I heard my mother deploying her absolute smoothest, most pragmatic, businesslike tone with the attending physician. Her voice did not shake. She did not ask how much pain I was in. Her very first question was a demand for a precise timeline of my recovery. She needed to know exactly when I would be fully lucid and capable of answering complex questions. Her second inquiry, delivered without a single ounce of hesitation, was whether or not I was physically allowed to operate a smartphone in the intensive care unit. My father then chimed in, his deep, gruff voice cutting through the clinical quiet. He completely bypassed my medical prognosis to ask the administrative desk if my premium corporate health insurance plan would cover the entire hospital stay and demanded immediate confirmation that the family would not be held liable for any out-of-pocket emergency expenses. They were not treating my near-fatal collapse as a family tragedy. They were managing it like an unexpected logistical hurdle in a corporate supply chain. An hour later, the distinct overpowering scent of high-end designer cologne invaded my sterile room, announcing my brother long before he actually spoke. Jay strolled in, his posture incredibly relaxed. He had a pair of expensive mirrored sunglasses casually pushed up onto his perfectly styled hair. He stood beside my bed, looking down at the tubes snaking out of my arms. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not offer a comforting touch. Instead, he pulled his smartphone from his pocket, leaned his head in close to my pale, exhausted face, and snapped a quick photograph. He muttered something under his breath about taking a picture for family purposes, though I knew it was merely performative proof to justify whatever narrative he was spinning to his online followers. He then turned away from me, directing his attention to my mother, who had finally stepped into the room. He leaned in and lowered his voice to a hushed, urgent whisper. He asked her right over my broken body if there was any possible way I could just wake up for 5 minutes to verify a few urgent legal documents. He complained that the reservation deadline for his pre-construction condominium was rapidly closing, and he absolutely needed my digital signature before the end of the business day. Their frantic plotting was interrupted by the return of my doctor. He stepped into the room and firmly announced the reality of my situation. He stated that while I had miraculously survived the emergency surgery and was technically out of the most immediate critical danger, my condition remained incredibly fragile. He mandated that I be kept under strict 24-hour cardiac and digestive monitoring in the hospital for at least several more days. I watched my mother process this medical mandate from the corner of my eye. I saw a visible, undeniable wave of tension leave her shoulders. She exhaled a long, dramatic sigh. It was a sound I knew intimately. It was not the profound, earth-shattering relief of a mother realizing her child was going to survive. It was the distinct administrative relief of a woman realizing that a highly inconvenient medical emergency would not force her to cancel her prepaid international flights or attend a funeral. That very evening, as the sun set outside my hospital window and the pain medication dragged me back towards sleep, my family held a brief, hushed conference right at the foot of my bed. I listened, paralyzed and mute, as they efficiently finalized their plans. They unanimously decided to proceed with their trip to Mexico, exactly as scheduled. My mother adjusted the strap of her leather handbag, cast one fleeting glance at my heavily medicated form, and justified their abandonment with a chilling practiced ease. She declared to my father and brother that I was in excellent medical hands, that the absolute worst was over, and that Jace's golden opportunity simply waited for absolutely no one. I heard the soft squeak of their rubber soles turning toward the door. I listened as their footsteps faded completely down the long linoleum hospital corridor, leaving me entirely alone with the steady mocking beep of the heart monitor and the overwhelming realization that I was utterly dispensable. The fog of the heavy anesthesia finally burned off completely somewhere around 2 in the morning. I opened my eyes to the rhythmic sweeping green glow of the vital sign monitor and the sterile silhouette of a plastic water pitcher resting on the tray table. The room was draped in the deep, heavy silence unique to hospital wards in the middle of the night, a silence broken only by the mechanical hiss of oxygen and the distant squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. I turned my head slowly, fighting the stiff ache in my neck, and looked at the vile recliner positioned beside my bed. It was completely empty. The beige synthetic leather was perfectly smooth, bearing no indentations, no discarded jackets, no rumpled magazines. It was a chilling, cavernous kind of empty. It was the physical manifestation of my entire role in the Rivera family. The heavy door swung open with a soft click, and the night-charge nurse walked in to check my intravenous fluid drip. Her plastic identification badge read, "Marble possessed the kind of tired, no-nonsense demeanor that comes from years of working the graveyard shift on a surgical recovery floor. She did not possess the forced, sugary bedside manner that patronized patients." She moved with efficient precision, her eyes scanning the digital readouts before finally looking down at my pale, sweaty face. When I finally found enough moisture in my throat to speak, my voice was a broken, raspy whisper. I asked her where my mother and father had gone. Marble did not pause her work adjusting the clear plastic tubing. She did not offer a pitying smile or try to soften the blow. She looked at me with a flat, brutally honest expression and said they were here for less than half an hour before they gathered their bags and left for the airport. Later that morning, as the pale sunlight filtered through the blinds, a ward assistant returned my personal belongings in a clear plastic hospital bag. My hands shook slightly as I pulled out my mobile phone. The glass screen lit up with a handful of brief, sterile notifications. There were no missed calls. There were no frantic voicemails begging me to wake up. There was a text message from my mother advising me to rest and explicitly telling me not to overcomplicate things with the doctors. The subtext was clear: do not incur extra charges and do not make a scene. There was a single curt line from my father asking for the exact date of my discharge so they would know when I was back at my desk to handle the upcoming tax deadlines. And then there was Jace. He had sent a higher resolution photograph of a pristine white sand beach meeting turquoise water complete, with a colorful tropical cocktail resting on the edge of the frame. The caption beneath the photo read simply, "Wish you were here." The outrage did not hit me immediately. Anger requires energy, and I had none left to give. Instead, a profound, suffocating humiliation washed over me. A slow-moving tide of cold realization. I let the phone slip from my fingers, letting it fall onto the stark white sheets. I did not cry. My tear ducts felt completely dry, as hollowed out as my physical core. I just lay there perfectly still, staring up at the acoustic tiles of the ceiling, tracing the tiny repetitive perforations with my tired eyes. In the quiet dark of my recovery room, a massive, crushing truth settled heavily over my chest. This abandonment was not an anomaly. It was not a sudden lapse in judgment. This was the defining foundational rule of my entire existence. For decades, the unspoken family contract had required me to simply understand their priorities, silently endure the consequences of their selfish actions, and magically heal myself in total isolation so I could be useful to them once again. My internal organs literally tearing themselves apart and bleeding out onto an office floor was nothing more than an inconvenient disruption to their Mexican itinerary. I drifted in and out of a heavy medicated haze for the rest of that day and deep into the following evening. Sometime past midnight, Marable returned to my room to record my blood pressure and check my surgical dressings. The hospital ward had settled back into its eerie nocturnal rhythm. As Marable wrapped the dark nylon cuff around my bruised bicep, she casually glanced toward the brightly lit hallway and asked a question that completely derailed my understanding of the world. She kept her voice low, a gentle murmur against the hum of the machines, and asked if the woman out in the corridor was my aunt. I blinked, the heavy painkillers making my thoughts incredibly sluggish. I turned my head to look at her, my brow furrowing in genuine confusion. I shook my head slightly against the stiff pillow, confessing that I assumed absolutely no one had come to see me. I told her my family was thousands of miles away drinking margaritas on a coastline. Marble paused, letting the Velcro strap hang loose for a moment. She leaned her hip against the metal railing of the bed and told me a story that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. She explained that since the very first night, merely hours after my family had rushed off to catch their departing flight, a middle-aged woman, wearing a dark, sharply tailored coat, had been arriving at the ward very late in the evening. This stranger did not storm the nurse's station demanding immediate answers. She did not attempt to push her way into my room while I was vulnerable, unconscious, and recovering from invasive surgery. Instead, she just sat in the stiff, uncomfortable waiting area chairs directly outside my glass door for hours at a time. According to Marable, this woman always carried a thick, worn leather briefcase that looked like it held decades of important documents. She would speak in low, exceptionally polite, yet firm tones with the hospital billing department on the first floor. She managed to secure updates on my status without ever overstepping the strict medical privacy boundaries. She checked with the nursing staff to ensure my pain management was adequate and that my vitals were stabilizing. And then, having gathered her intelligence, she would retreat to the designated waiting area down the hall and sit perfectly still. Marble noted that the woman acted as though she was deeply afraid her sudden, unannounced presence inside the room would be too abrupt, too jarring for a patient just waking up from severe physical trauma. She kept a respectful, silent vigil. She was a ghost standing guard at the absolute edge of my shattered reality, asking for nothing but proximity. The sheer weight of this revelation kept me wide awake. I lay rigid beneath the thin, scratchy hospital blanket, my eyes fixed intently on the rectangular window embedded in my heavy wooden door. The corridor outside was bathed in the harsh low light of the graveyard shift, casting long, dramatic shadows across the linoleum floor. Sometime near dawn, perhaps around 4 in the morning, a shadow shifted purposefully across the glass pane. I strained my neck, fighting the sharp, pulling ache of the stitches in my abdomen, desperate to get a better look. I could only make out a silhouette through the frosted edges of the reinforced glass. It was the figure of a woman sitting on the wooden bench across the hall. Her posture was remarkably straight, projecting an aura of intense, unyielding composure and quiet authority. She was not nervously scrolling through a bright smartphone screen, and she was not pacing the linoleum floor in a state of visible anxiety. She was just present. She was watching over the space. She was waiting. And in that cold, deeply clinical room, completely and utterly abandoned by the people whose blood ran in my veins, the quiet, disciplined stillness of that anonymous shadow made me feel profoundly anchored. It was an inexplicable feeling, but the steady presence of a total stranger sitting in the dark felt vastly more secure than any dismissive text message had ever bothered to send. By the time the clock struck 2 in the morning on my 4th night in the surgical recovery ward, The heavy, suffocating weight of the unknown had finally eclipsed my physical pain. The persistent mystery of the silent woman keeping vigil in the hallway had consumed whatever small fraction of mental energy I had managed to scrape together. I could not sleep. I stared at the ceiling tiles, my mind running through endless paranoid scenarios. Finally, I reached out with a trembling hand and pressed the red plastic call button pinned to my mattress. When Maribel, the night-charged nurse, pushed through the heavy wooden door to check my vitals, I did not ask for another dose of painkillers. I looked her dead in the eye and demanded she tell me the exact name of the woman sitting out in the corridor. Maribel did not hesitate. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her scrub pocket, glanced at the visitor log she had copied down, and read the name aloud. Naomi Wren. The syllables dropped into the sterile, heavily air-conditioned atmosphere of the hospital room like a dense, foreign object shattering a glass table. I physically recoiled against my pillows. I knew that name. I had known it for many years, though I had never once seen the face of the woman it belonged to. In the Rivera household, Naomi Wren was not considered a human being. She was treated as a curse word, a boogeyman invoked to enforce family loyalty. My mother, Eleanor, used to spit that name out from between tightly clenched teeth, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. Elena had aggressively painted Naomi as a predatory home-wrecking attorney. She claimed Naomi was a vicious corporate vulture who had tried to rip our family apart during a vague, highly dramatized legal dispute many years ago. I had been explicitly, repeatedly warned by my mother to run the other way and cut all communication if that woman ever dared to approach me. I swallowed hard, ignoring the sharp ache in my throat, and told Maribel to let her inside. A minute later, the door slowly swung open. Naomi Wren did not look anything like a vulture, and she certainly did not look like the chaotic villain my mother had described. She looked like a woman who commanded absolute respect without ever having to raise her voice by a single decile. She wore a sharply tailored dark charcoal blazer over a crisp silk blouse, her posture impeccably straight. When she walked into the room, she did not rush to my bedside. She did not attempt to hold my hand, stroke my hair, or manufacture any false, uncomfortable intimacy. Instead, she stopped exactly 3 feet from the foot of my bed, maintaining a perfectly polite, highly professional distance. She looked at me not with the cloying pity my parents used, but with the steady, focused, and deeply serious intensity of someone who was finally fulfilling a very old, incredibly important promise. She spoke slowly, ensuring every single word was meticulously articulated and impossible to misunderstand. She'd introduced herself formally as the managing partner of a wealth management firm and the designated legal executive for the estate of Camilla Rivera. Camilla was my paternal grandmother. She had passed away over 14 months ago. I stared at Naomi, the rhythmic green line of my heart monitor suddenly accelerating on the screen beside me. I shook my head, my voice barely a raspy whisper, and told her there had to be some sort of massive administrative error. I explained that when my grandmother died, my mother had taken total control of the arrangements. Eleanor had sat me down at the kitchen island, sighed with a heavy performative grief, and informed the family that poor Camilla had left this world entirely destitute. According to my parents, my grandmother had left behind absolutely nothing but a terrifying mountain of high-interest credit card debt and a few boxes of moth-eaten clothes. We had not even held a proper memorial service because my parents adamantly claimed they could not afford the funeral home fees. Naomi did not flinch. She did not offer a sympathetic smile. She simply unlatched her worn leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, firmly bound legal folio. She informed me with the cold, undeniable precision of a surgical blade that my grandmother was not broke. In fact, she was quite the opposite. Long before her health began to rapidly decline, Camilla had quietly and independently liquidated a highly valuable residential duplex she owned outright in the city of Tempe. She had taken the entirety of those substantial profits and established a heavily protected, airtight private trust fund. That trust was designated entirely exclusively for my benefit. There was, however, one very specific unyielding legal stipulation written into the core framework of the document. The financial assets could only be legally transferred once the originating paperwork was physically placed into my own two hands by Naomi herself. My parents were explicitly legally barred from acting as intermediaries or financial proxies. My chest tightened as a wave of cold nausea washed over me. I asked her the only logical question remaining. If this massive trust fund had existed for well over a year, why was I only hearing about its existence now while lying broken and bleeding in a surgical recovery ward? The second truth Naomi delivered was infinitely crueler and far more devastating than the first. She had not been silent. Over the past 12 months, Naomi had dispatched dozens of official certified letters requiring my direct signature. She had left countless voicemails on my mobile phone. She had even gone so far as to hire licensed private couriers and processed servers to deliver the sealed parcels directly to my residential address. Every single attempt at communication had been systematically intercepted. Certified letters were signed for with cleverly forged initials and promptly destroyed before I ever walked through the front door. Voicemails were remotely deleted from our shared family cellular data plan before my phone ever had the chance to display a notification. My parents, the people who demanded my constant loyalty, had constructed an impenetrable, invisible firewall around my entire existence. They had actively conspired to keep me perpetually starved for resources, deliberately blinding me to my own financial independence so I would remain their reliable, exhausted, and desperately compliant workhorse. My entire past, my understanding of my own struggle, was completely rewritten in a matter of seconds. I had never been drowning because of bad luck. I was drowning because my parents were standing on my shoulders to keep themselves afloat. I looked at the thick stack of papers in Naomi's hands and asked her why she was sitting out in a cold hospital corridor in the middle of the night instead of just walking in during regular visiting hours. Naomi folded her hands neatly over the leather portfolio. She explained that she had been aggressively monitoring my digital financial footprint, searching for a clean, verifiable way to locate me completely outside of my parents' sphere of influence. When my sudden catastrophic medical emergency triggered a massive insurance authorization alert, she finally found my exact location. She had not simply been keeping a silent, emotional vigil outside my door. She had been actively playing tactical defense. Naomi revealed that she had quietly gone down to the hospital billing department on the very first day and paid my entire out-of-pocket medical deductible in full. She did this specifically to neutralize my parents' primary weapon. She knew exactly how Elena operated. If I had an outstanding, crippling medical balance, my mother and father would use that massive financial burden as leverage. They would use the debt to force an unsafe premature discharge from the ward or worse, use the guise of generously paying my hospital bills to demand legal access to my secure medical records and my personal devices. Naomi had silently purchased my physical safety. I closed my eyes, thinking I had finally reached the absolute muddy bottom of my family's betrayal. But Naomi was not finished. The deepest, most violently twisting knife was saved for the very end of our conversation. She reached back into her folio and withdrew a single, brightly colored sheet of heavy stock paper. It looked entirely out of place among the drab black and white legal documents. She explained that while conducting her extensive forensic sweep of my financial records to track me down, she had uncovered a massive glaring anomaly within the national credit bureaus. Someone had recently initiated a hard credit inquiry using my exact Social Security number. But it was not just a simple background check. My name, my flawless, hard-earned credit history, and a perfectly replicated copy of my electronic signature had been actively used to legally underwrite a highly lucrative commercial real estate application. Naomi stepped forward and slid the paper across my rolling plastic tray table. I opened my eyes and stared at the glossy logo printed boldly at the top of the page. It was the branding for an exclusive luxury pre-construction condominium development. The property was located directly on the coast of Cancun. The air vanished from my lungs. The photograph Jace had texted me, the one with the turquoise water and the mocking caption, wishing I was there, flashed violently in my mind. My parents had not just abandoned me in a hospital to fly to Mexico for a simple vacation. They had actively, knowingly committed felony identity theft to serve as the primary financial guarantors for the exact same luxury property my brother was currently boasting about to the internet. They had extracted the blood, the sweat, and the literal lining of my stomach to purchase their tropical paradise, leaving me behind in a sterile room to rot while they built a new life entirely in my name. On the morning of my 7th day in the cardiac and digestive monitoring unit, the heavy wooden door to my room swung wide open. The unmistakable rhythmic clicking of wheels against linoleum announced her arrival before she even spoke. It was my mother. Elena stepped into the sterile fluorescent-lit space, dragging a small, meticulously packed designer carry-on suitcase behind her. She pushed a pair of oversized, dark luxury sunglasses up onto her perfectly highlighted hair. Her skin boasted a deep, floorless, golden tan that screamed of expensive beachside cabanas and bottomless margaritas. She did not carry the heavy, guilty posture of a woman who had abandoned her eldest daughter in a post-operative recovery ward. Instead, she swept into the room with the breezy, impatient attitude of a busy parent swinging by a day camp to pick up a slightly bothersome child. She started with her signature move. Her voice dripped with an artificial sugary sweetness that made my healing stomach violently churn. She called me her brave girl and loudly proclaimed how eager she was to finally get me out of this depressing environment. But the warm facade cracked into sharp, jagged pieces the very second she realized I was not sitting on the edge of the mattress in my street clothes. She demanded to know why I had not yet signed the standard discharge paperwork. Her tone shifted from maternal concern to sharp administrative annoyance. She immediately held out her freshly manicured hand, expecting me to drop my mobile phone and my banking security tokens right into her palm. She claimed she needed immediate access to my accounts to settle the ridiculous, out-of-network insurance fees before they ruined our collective credit. I simply looked at her, my hands resting completely still on the thin white blanket, and told her the hospital required her presence at the main nursing station to clear a newly flagged administrative dispute regarding my patient access rights. She let out a dramatic, deeply exasperated sigh, spun on her designer heel, and marched out into the hallway. I could hear the sharp click of her shoes approach the curved desk where Marable, the fiercely protective night charge nurse whose shift had just ended, was finishing her final charts. Marble did not offer my mother a polite customer service smile. She simply slid a heavy metal-bound visitor logbook across the counter. Marble calmly explained that because there was now a formalized dispute regarding my emergency contact list, Elena was legally required to sign a physical ledger before demanding any further medical documents. My mother snatched the plastic pen, her mouth pulled into a tight, condescending smile. She looked down at the paper, then she stopped moving entirely. From my vantage point, through the open door, I watched the exact moment my mother's reality fractured. According to what Marble told me later, the sudden color change on my mother's face was a horrifying spectacle she would remember for the rest of her life. Elena did not look angry. Anger is a secondary emotion, a luxury for people who feel they hold the upper hand. My mother looked entirely, fundamentally terrified. It was the visceral, suffocating panic of a thief realizing the damning evidence was not only intact, but was currently breathing the same recirculated air. She was staring at the name Naomi Wren, written in neat, precise ink, lobbed repeatedly across night 4, night 5, and night 6. Before Elena could even drop the pen, a shadow detached itself from the alcove near the waiting area. Naomi stepped quietly into the door frame of my room. At that precise second, my father, Martin, finally lumbered down the hallway clutching a lukewarm cup of cafeteria coffee. He took one look at the impeccably dressed woman standing at the foot of my bed and completely froze. The coffee sloshed over the plastic rim and burned his knuckles, but he did not even flinch. For years, they had painted Naomi as a faceless, predatory phantom. Yet, standing face to face with her, neither of my parents demanded to know who she was. They recognized her instantly. Their profound silence was the ultimate confession. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She commanded the room with the cold, absolute authority of a judge delivering a fatal verdict. She looked directly at my father, then shifted her gaze to my mother and began to speak. She stated with razor-sharp articulation that Camilla Rivera had never intended to leave her eldest granddaughter destitute. She declared that my grandmother had spent her final months meticulously building an impenetrable legal fortress precisely because she knew exactly what kind of financial parasites her own son and daughter-in-law truly were. Naomi methodically laid out the timeline of the hidden trust, tearing down the false narrative my parents had spent over a year constructing. The walls were rapidly closing in on Elena, driven into a corner by the sheer, undeniable weight of the truth. My mother lost her iron grip on her own deception, her face twisted into an ugly, desperate sneer, and she spat out a sentence that instantly sealed her own fate. She pointed a trembling finger at the estate lawyer and loudly hissed that Naomi was never, under any legal circumstances, allowed to hand the trust documents to me directly. The room plunged into a deafening absolute silence. That single reckless sentence echoed off the sterile hospital walls. It was the final undeniable proof. It confirmed that the missing letters, the intercepted couriers, and the deleted voicemails were not the result of some vague administrative error or a tragic miscommunication. It was a highly calculated malicious cover-up. They knew the money existed, and they actively buried the information to keep me trapped as their personal indentured servant. They needed me desperate, and they needed me compliant. So they stole my inheritance to fund their own delusions. I felt a sudden, profound shift deep within my own chest. The physical weakness radiating from my surgical incision was completely eclipsed by a blinding absolute clarity. For 33 years, I had bent over backward to accommodate their demands, terrified of disrupting the delicate ecosystem of our family. Not anymore. I reached over, my hand remarkably steady, and pressed the red nurse call button pinned to my mattress. When Marble stepped into the doorway, standing right behind my frozen parents, I did not look at my mother or my father. I looked straight at the nurse. I formally requested that the hospital immediately revoke all emergency contact privileges previously granted to Martin and Elena Rivera. I demanded a complete lock on all my medical charts, explicitly forbidding any exchange of information with anyone claiming to be my immediate family. My mother finally found her voice. She stepped forward, the wheels of her luxury suitcase clicking against the floor, her tone pitching up into a frantic, desperate plea. She told me I was being completely unreasonable, that I was letting the heavy medication make me paranoid, and that we needed to go home and discuss this as a family. I turned my head, locked my eyes directly with hers, and delivered a single word. No, it was a short, simple syllable, but I spoke it with a voice so profoundly cold, so completely devoid of any lingering daughterly affection, that it instantly silenced the entire room. The power dynamic did not just shift, it shattered completely. For the first time in my entire life, I refused to absorb their chaos. I laid back against the stiff hospital pillows, watching the absolute horror dawn on my mother's tanned face as she finally realized that the reliable, compliant daughter she had built her life upon was completely, permanently gone. Once the heavy intravenous painkillers were dialed back to a manageable oral dosage, my hospital room transformed from a quiet place of physical recovery into a highly focused forensic command center. The rolling plastic tray table, previously used for bland oatmeal and small cups of water, now held Naomi Rin's sleek silver laptop and dozens of thick, heavily tabbed manila folders. We did not speak about my family's emotional failings anymore. We spoke in the cold, undeniable language of timestamps, notarized copies, auto-forwarding email protocols, and digital access logs. I was finally feeling the raw, sharp thrill of an investigator watching a massive, complex criminal conspiracy unraveled document by document. We started by pulling the access history on the shared cloud storage drive I had set up and paid for several years ago. I had originally created it because my mother constantly complained about losing her utility bills. I thought I was simply helping them stay organized. Instead, I had unwittingly built and funded their personal armory. Naomi brought up the administrative dashboard, her fingernail tracing the screen. We discovered that Elena had not just been asking for my help with their paperwork. She had been meticulously archiving my own. Every single high-resolution scan of my annual tax returns, my corporate income statements, my utility bills, serving as proof of residence, and crystal-clear image files of my physical signature had been downloaded and saved into a hidden password-protected folder. My mother had weaponized my lifelong habit of managing their administrative chaos, turning my reliability into a fully stocked identity theft portfolio. Then we moved to my father. Martin was a man who routinely claimed he could not figure out how to restart his own mobile phone or attach a photograph to a text message. He used his supposed technological illiteracy to force me to do all the heavy lifting. Yet, as Naomi pulled up the digital audit trail from the Cancun luxury development group, that carefully crafted facade completely disintegrated. My father had not acted alone. He had utilized the services of a highly questionable mortgage broker, a man he played golf with on Sunday mornings. The server log showed the exact timeline. On the 15th of October, at 3:15 in the afternoon, while I was sitting in a grueling corporate compliance meeting, Martin's broker friend had uploaded my entire Stofor financial dossier to the Mexican real estate portal. They had seamlessly slotted my name in as the primary financial guarantor to secure the massive escrow deposit for the luxury condominium. Martin did not need to understand technology. He only needed to understand how to hand stolen goods to a professional. If a small naive part of me still hoped my brother was simply a foolish bystander, that hope was violently extinguished an hour later. While auditing the connected devices authorized on my cloud account, Naomi uncovered a synced backup of a mobile messaging thread between Jace and my mother. Reading the bright blue text bubbles felt like swallowing broken glass. They were openly discussing the Cancun property requirements. Eleanor had expressed a brief moment of logistical worry about the background check. Jace had responded with a laughing emoji, followed by a sentence that burned itself permanently into my retinas. He wrote that my pristine credit score existed for absolutely no other reason than to save the family one more time. He was not a victim of my parents' manipulation. He was an active, eager beneficiary who viewed my financial stability as his own personal trust fund. But the absolute darkest revelation was yet to come. Naomi closed the laptop and opened a heavy leather-bound ledger containing the historical accounting for Camiller's private estate. The trust fund my grandmother had established was not designed to sit dormant. It had been programmed to disperse small, manageable maintenance stipends annually, specifically designed to help me build a safety net. There were records of checks issued for $3,000 here, $5,000 there. I stared at the ledger, my heart pounding in my ears. I had never seen a single one of those checks. Naomi turned the page, revealing a stack of photocopied bank statements. Every single annual distribution check had been mailed directly to my parents' residential address. My mother, who controlled the physical mailbox with an iron grip, had intercepted every envelope. The checks were forged, endorsed, and quietly absorbed into their joint checking account before I ever even knew they had been printed. To prove the depth of the betrayal, Naomi pulled a heavy cardstock receipt from a plastic sleeve. It was a failed delivery notification for a certified letter originating from her law office, explicitly detailing the trust fund's existence. The receipt required a physical signature upon delivery. Right there on the dotted line was Eleanor's distinct-looking cursive handwriting, but it was the timestamp printed next to the signature that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. The date was the 18th of August. I remembered the 18th of August with agonizing clarity. That was the exact afternoon my mother had called me at my office, her voice trembling and thick with tears. She had told me she was sitting at the inpatient hospice facility, holding my dying grandmother's hand, too consumed by grief to deal with anything else. She had begged me to wire her $800 to cover emergency end-of-life care expenses. I had sent the money immediately, skipping my own meals for a week to make up the difference, but she had never been at the hospice facility. The timestamp proved she was standing on her own front porch, signing for the very legal documents that would have set me free, and then turning around to extort me for even more cash using a dying woman as bait. All the disgusting, jagged pieces of the puzzle finally slammed together, forming a horrifyingly clear picture. My family had not merely been draining my bank account. They had engineered my entire reality. They deliberately kept me in a perpetual state of financial and emotional exhaustion. If I was always stressed, always working overtime, always worried about paying their next manufactured emergency bill, I would never have the free time, the mental bandwidth, or the fundamental self-confidence to stop and investigate what was actually happening under my own name. I was a prisoner who had been convinced she was the warden. As I sat in that hospital bed staring at the mountain of undeniable paper trail evidence, the sharpest pain did not come from the sheer amount of money they had stolen. The money was just math. The true, agonizing heartbreak came from a profound philosophical shift in how I understood my own life. I finally realized that leaving me alone and bleeding in a hospital to board a flight to Mexico was not a sudden impulsive act of selfishness. It was not a tragic mistake or a momentary lapse in parental judgment. It was the perfectly natural, entirely logical consequence of a deeply entrenched system. For over a decade, they had not viewed me as a daughter, a sister, or a human being deserving of care. They had viewed me purely as a highly efficient, self-repaying resource. And you do not cancel a luxury vacation just because the automated teller machine breaks down. You simply walk away and expect it to be fixed and dispensing cash by the time you return. Anger usually demands an immediate chaotic audience. It wants to scream, to shatter porcelain against a wall, and to broadcast its raw pain to anyone willing to listen. I did absolutely none of those things. I did not draft a dramatic, highly emotional post on social media to publicly expose my blood relatives. I did not dial my mother's number to hurl well-deserved insults through the cellular network. I did something far more terrifying to people who thrive on emotional manipulation. I became surgically, flawlessly precise. I asked the ward nurse for a fresh yellow legal pad and a black ballpoint pen. I sat up straight against the stiff hospital pillows, ignoring the dull, persistent ache deep in my abdomen, and I began to write a comprehensive list. It was a meticulous inventory of every single lock I needed to change, every digital door I needed to deadbolt, and every financial bridge I needed to incinerate. The time for crying was over. It was time to execute a procedural dismantling of my family's access to my life. My very first target was the absolute bedrock of their scheme. I bypassed the standard temporary fraud alerts and initiated a severe 7-year extended security freeze across all major consumer credit bureaus. I filled out an official federal identity theft affidavit, swearing under strict penalty of perjury that I had absolutely no prior knowledge of any commercial real estate applications bearing my legal name. Then I drafted a formal, heavily legally worded letter of dispute. I directed it straight to the executive underwriting department of the luxury lending firm handling the Cancun condominium. I did not just request that they cancel the application. I demanded a full internal corporate audit of their guarantor verification protocols. I insisted they produce the exact time, date, and geographical location of the notary public who supposedly witnessed my physical signature while I was incapacitated and heavily medicated on a surgical table. My parents had forgotten one crucial fatal detail about my career. I was the senior compliance and payroll manager for a massive municipal transit authority. I understood the sheer, destructive power of corporate bureaucracy better than anyone in my family. I sent a highly secure email directly to the Director of Legal Affairs at Grey Haven Transit Systems. I kept my tone entirely professional, stating clearly that an unauthorized third party had fraudulently accessed and distributed my secure employment verification data, my highly confidential salary history, and my internal corporate tax documents. The response was instantaneous and utterly ruthless. By 2 in the afternoon, the company had launched a full-scale internal beta security sweep. They did not treat this as a petty domestic dispute. They treated it as a critical high-level breach of their human resources firewall. Grey Haven's formidable legal team began aggressively tracking down exactly who had requested those specific files and where they had been digitally transmitted. In their blind greed, my parents had accidentally invited the massive, unforgiving weight of a corporate legal department right to their own front door. While the corporate machinery ground into motion, Naomi Wren guided me through the tactical reconstruction of my personal infrastructure. We did not just change a few passwords. We burned the old system to the ground and salted the earth. I opened entirely new checking and savings accounts, at a completely different banking institution located miles across town. I transferred every single cent of my hard-earned money out of the legacy accounts my parents knew how to monitor. We secured a private post office box 2 zip codes away from my apartment and filed a permanent immediate change of address with the Federal Postal Service. Every shared digital cloud drive was wiped clean and permanently deleted. Every automatic payment linked to their utility bills, their premium streaming services, and their property insurance was immediately and ruthlessly canceled. I officially permanently resigned from my lifelong unpaid position as the Rivera family administrative assistant. The silence on their end did not last very long. The exact moment the very first canceled utility payment bounced, my mobile phone began to light up. My mother, Elena, employed a chaotic, rapidly shifting strategy. She started with a relentless barrage of text messages attempting to minimize the massive felony she had committed. She framed the entire identity theft operation as a silly, blown out of proportion family misunderstanding. She typed incredibly long paragraphs about how my sudden illness had simply made everyone act out of character, and how my grandmother would be absolutely heartbroken to see us fighting over such trivial administrative details. She was trying to weaponize my own guilt against me one last time. When I did not immediately reply to her emotional bait, the soft silk slipped completely off the cold steel. Her messages turned incredibly venomous. She accused me of being a bitter, ungrateful child who was deliberately trying to destroy her own parents just to prove a selfish point. She demanded I answer the phone immediately, calling me repeatedly until I finally had her primary number restricted by the cellular carrier network. Jace, ever the charming opportunist, tried a completely different angle. He sent messages laced with heavy, calculated nostalgia, trying to play the role of the devoted, innocent younger brother. He texted me about the time I helped him fix his bicycle chain when he was 10 years old, or the summer we spent eating cheap ice cream on the front porch. He was desperately trying to summon the ghost of the older sister who had always shielded him from consequence. When the sweet childhood memories failed to elicit any response, Jace quickly pivoted to a slick, highly subtle form of emotional blackmail. He sent a lengthy message warning me to think about the bigger picture. He casually suggested that if I allowed this little disagreement to blow up into a legal issue, the whole family would lose absolutely everything just because of a few administrative signatures. He fully expected me to believe that enforcing the law and protecting my own identity was somehow a heavier, far more destructive sin than their act of stealing it. They wanted a dramatic reaction. They desperately needed me to scream, to cry, or to threaten them because outward emotion is something they knew exactly how to manage. A screaming daughter meant I was still engaged, still deeply attached, and still entirely capable of being manipulated. So I starved them of it completely. I carefully played the role of the exhausted, deeply confused patient who did not yet possess the full, terrifying picture of their betrayal. I responded to Jace with a single, incredibly brief text message. I simply typed that I was very tired, that I was still in a tremendous amount of physical pain from the surgery, and that we would just have to see what happened next. It was exactly enough of a vague concession to make them believe the door was still slightly cracked open. It was a carefully measured, highly strategic drop of hope. It was explicitly designed to make them think I was wavering, to make them believe that I could still be bullied back into submission if they could just manage to get me into a room and sit me down to talk it out. I let them believe they still retained a fighting chance to control the narrative. But deep down in the quiet, absolute solitude of my hospital room, surrounded by newly minted bank cards and heavily encrypted legal files, I made a solemn, unbreakable vow. I decided that the very last thing I owed myself, after 33 long years of silent servitude, was to ensure this toxic illusion shattered completely. I would not let them sweep their crimes under the rug in the private, hushed confines of our living room. I was going to let the absolute truth detonate in an environment so sterile, so brightly lit, and so heavily documented that not a single member of my family would ever be able to distort the reality of what they had done. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, masquerading as a desperate plea for maternal reconciliation. My mother sent a carefully worded text message suggesting we all sit down for a quiet, civilized dinner. She proposed a highly exclusive, ridiculously expensive steakhouse located in the upscale dining district of downtown Phoenix. She specifically mentioned that she had gone ahead and reserved one of their private soundproofed dining rooms. According to her message, this lavish expense was strictly necessary so the family could finally calm down, clear the air, and put this unfortunate series of misunderstandings behind us. I stared at the glowing screen of my new mobile phone. I knew exactly what that private room actually represented. It was not a neutral ground for healing. It was a secluded interrogation chamber. The final deadline to secure the escrow for the luxury condominium in Mexico was rapidly approaching, and since I had frozen the credit file, they desperately needed my physical, legally binding signature on a stack of revised adjustment forms to keep their tropical fantasy from collapsing entirely. Less than an hour after my mother reached out, a second message chimed. It was from my father. Martin, who almost never initiated digital communication, typed a short, jagged sentence demanding I keep this dinner strictly between the four of us. He wrote that it was time to handle our business behind closed doors so we did not embarrass the family name in public. That single line confirmed everything I needed to know. The sheer arrogance had finally cracked, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were standing on the edge of a massive legal cliff. They knew they had touched a live wire, and they were scrambling to ground it before the voltage stopped their hearts. When I showed the messages to Naomi Wren, I fully expected her to advise me to ignore the invitation and let the legal process grind them down from a safe distance. Instead, the sharp, elegant estate lawyer leaned back in her leather chair, stapled her fingers, and told me I was absolutely going to attend that dinner. She did not want me to hide. She wanted me to walk into that restaurant looking completely healthy, radiating an icy calm, and projecting the exact image my family expected to see. She wanted them to feel comfortable enough to completely expose their true predatory nature. But more importantly, she wanted them to expose it in front of a very specific audience they had no idea was listening. Over the next 48 hours, a silent, devastatingly precise operation was constructed entirely out of their view. The high-end steakhouse in Phoenix featured a layout that perfectly suited our needs. The private dining room my mother had booked shared a thin, decorative, wood-paneled wall with an identical private suite right next door. Naomi secured the adjoining room under the name of her law firm, while my parents and brother planned to ambush me with forged documents over expensive cuts of beef. We were assembling a firing squad of accountability just a few inches away. The guest list for Naomi's room was small but incredibly lethal. It included the senior fraud investigator representing the commercial lender financing the Cancun property, a stateless licensed notary public representative to verify the tampering of the digital seals, and a highly aggressive civil litigation attorney prepared to file immediate injunctions regarding my stolen identity and the embezzled trust funds. The trap was structurally flawless, but the true master stroke came from the sheer volume of undeniable evidence we had gathered. The morning of the dinner, Marable, the fiercely loyal charge nurse from the cardiac ward, hand-delivered a sealed envelope to Naomi's office. It contained an official, highly detailed medical affidavit signed by the chief hospital administrator and my attending surgeon. The document certified with exact timestamps that during the precise hours the digital signatures were supposedly executed on the Mexican real estate portal. I was under heavy intravenous narcotic sedation following major abdominal surgery. The hospital legally verified that I possessed absolutely zero physical or mental capacity to authorize any financial transactions whatsoever. The signature was a profound, undeniable fraud. Then a final unexpected gift arrived. Naomi's relentless pressure on the mortgage broker my father had used finally broke the man's nerve. Terrified of losing his own professional license and facing federal wire fraud charges, the broker surrendered a digital audio file. It was a recorded telephone call from my mother's place on the very afternoon I was bleeding out on the floor of the transit authority. I sat in Naomi's office and listened to Alina's frantic, demanding voice echoing through the computer speakers. She was aggressively pushing the broker to expedite the real estate file. When the broker hesitated, asking for my direct verbal confirmation, my mother snapped at him. She stated clearly that her daughter was currently in the hospital but would definitely sign the papers and instructed the broker to simply send the electronic links directly through the family's shared accounts. It was the smoking gun proving premeditated intent and active conspiracy. I did not cancel the dinner. On the evening of the meeting, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my new apartment. I chose a tailored dark navy suit that masked the slight weight I had lost during my recovery. I applied my makeup with careful precision, concealing the lingering pale exhaustion beneath my eyes. I made sure my posture was impeccably straight. I was determined to walk into that restaurant and let my family believe that the sterile hospital environment, the physical agony, and their decades of relentless guilt training had successfully beaten me back into my old reliable shape. I wanted them to look at me and see the compliant, exhausted workhorse they had exploited for 33 years. The drive to downtown Phoenix was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence. The desert heat radiated off the asphalt, mirroring the slow, boiling tension building in my chest. I knew exactly what was waiting for me behind the heavy oak doors of the restaurant. They thought they had engineered a master class in emotional manipulation. They thought they were holding all the cards, ready to slide a pen across a white tablecloth and force me back into my designated cage. They genuinely believed they were inviting me to a reconciliation. They had absolutely no idea they were casually strolling into their own execution. As I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the ornate glass doors of the steakhouse, I felt a strange, profound sense of detachment. The woman who had collapsed in the office hallway, terrified of displeasing her parents, was completely dead. She had bled out and been left behind. The person walking toward the private dining room that evening was not their beautiful daughter. She was the very first woman in the history of the Rivera family who was finally willing to let the undeniable, brutal weight of the paperwork speak on her behalf. The storm was fully formed. The thunder was rolling in, and they were about to find out exactly where the lightning was going to strike. The heavy oak door of the private dining suite clicked shut behind me, sealing us inside a quiet, opulent bubble that smelled of roasted garlic and expensive leather. The seating arrangement was aggressively predictable. My mother, Eleanor, sat to my immediate left, already dabbing the corners of her eyes with a linen napkin, producing just enough tears to look wounded, but not enough to ruin her perfect makeup. My father, Martin, sat directly across the table, his arms folded over his chest, projecting his trademark icy silence. And right beside him sat my brother, Jace. He was grinning, radiating that effortless golden boy charm, tapping a silver fountain pen against a thick stack of printed documents resting next to the bread basket. I took my seat and ordered a glass of sparkling water. I did not start a screaming match. I did not slam my fists against the polished mahogany. I simply sat back, smoothed the fabric of my navy suit, and let them talk. It is incredibly illuminating to let guilty people fill an awkward silence. Eleanor started the performance. She reached across the table, attempting to place her manicured hand over mine, spinning a sickeningly sweet narrative about how family is bound by sacrifice and unconditional love. She called the massive identity theft a simple, unfortunate misunderstanding born out of a desperate desire to secure our collective future. Martin grunted his agreement, finally breaking his silence to gruffly classify his collaboration with a shady mortgage broker as standard administrative procedure that I was blowing entirely out of proportion. Then Jace took over the pitch. He leaned forward, flashing his brightest smile, and called the fraudulent use of my credit profile a necessary temporary investment for the family. He promised that once the Cancun property started generating luxury rental income, they would pay me back every single cent. He picked up the silver pen, clicked the cap off, and slid it directly across the smooth wood toward my plate. He tapped the top page of his neatly organized stack of adjustment forms. He told me that all I needed to do was sign on the dotted lines, and all of this messy legal trouble would instantly vanish. In his mind, my signature was still their default property. I looked at the pen. I looked at my brother. And then, for the first time in what felt like a decade, I smiled a genuine, deeply satisfied smile. I did not reach for the silver pen. Instead, I reached down into my leather tote bag and pulled out my own folder. It was significantly thicker, vastly heavier, and infinitely more dangerous than his. I dropped it squarely onto the center of the table. The heavy thud rattled the crystal wine glasses. I opened the cover and began distributing the contents like a dealer at a high-stakes card table. I slid a stack of photocopied forged trust fund checks directly in front of my mother. I dropped the certified mail delivery receipts bearing her exact signature from the afternoon she claimed to be sitting at a hospice facility right on top of her butter plate. I slid the network access log showing exactly when my father downloaded my secure tax files across to Martin. I placed the notarized medical affidavit proving I was heavily sedated on intravenous narcotics during the precise hour the Mexican real estate portal registered my digital signature right in front of Jace. Finally, I placed the official certified letter from the commercial lending executive under the Cancun condominium brochure, confirming that the entire escrow account had been permanently frozen due to severe fraud allegations. The color drained from Eleanor's face so rapidly she looked physically ill. Martin stared at the network logs, his jaw completely slack. Jay stopped smiling. Before any of them could formulate a single lie, the decorative wood-paneled door connecting our suite to the adjacent private room swung open. Naomi Wren stepped through the threshold. She was flanked by two tall, serious-looking men wearing tailored gray suits. The sheer panic in the room spiked into a suffocating terror. Naomi stood at the head of the table. She introduced the first man as the senior fraud investigator for the primary lending institution backing the Cancun development. She introduced the second man as a ruthless civil litigation attorney whom I had formerly retained. That very morning, the investigator looked directly at Jace and informed him in a painfully flat bureaucratic voice that not only was the condominium deposit locked, but Jace was now permanently blacklisted from their entire global network. Furthermore, all digital communications between the family cellular plan and the complicit mortgage broker had been successfully subpoenaed for a pending federal inquiry. The civil attorney then turned to my parents, quietly stating that a comprehensive lawsuit was being filed at 9:00 the following morning regarding the blatant forgery, systematic embezzlement, and malicious concealment of the private trust assets left by Camila Rivera. Martin's face flushed a violent, angry red. He slammed his large hands down on the table, half rising from his chair, attempting to salvage his crumbling authority by resorting to sheer physical intimidation. He pointed a thick finger at me, his voice a low, threatening growl, demanding I call off these absolute strangers before I destroyed my own blood relatives. I did not flinch. I reached into the very back of my folder and pulled out the final piece of paper. It was not a legal threat or a financial audit. It was the absolute, undeniable emotional death blow. I slid the brightly colored photocopied hospital visitor log across the table until it rested exactly halfway between my mother and my father. I looked at Eleanor, my voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that carried perfectly through the silent room. I told her that she had spent my entire life teaching me that family is defined by the people who show up when it truly matters. I pointed to the logbook. I told them that it was absolutely wonderful because now we possessed a legally verified time-stamped ledger showing exactly who actually showed up in the middle of the night and who rushed to the airport to drink on a beach while I was bleeding from my internal organs. No one spoke. There was absolutely no defense against the ink on that page. It was cold, hard, unassailable proof of their complete moral bankruptcy. I stood up from my chair. I picked up my leather tote bag and slung it over my shoulder. I looked down at the three people who had drained my life force for 33 years. I told them I was refusing to sign their adjustment forms. I was refusing to save their fraudulent investment. And most importantly, I was refusing to ever clean up their messes again. I turned my back and walked toward the heavy oak door leading out to the main restaurant floor. I did not even make it to the brass handle before the explosion occurred behind me. The unified front completely shattered. Elena immediately started screaming at Martin for using a broker who was stupid enough to get caught. Martin roared back, blaming Jace for dragging them into a greedy, impossible real estate scheme. Jace yelled at both of them, his voice cracking with sheer panic, demanding to know how he was supposed to protect his online brand with a massive fraud investigation tied to his legal main. They were tearing each other to absolute shreds, instantly turning into vicious, cornered animals because the reliable shield they had always used to absorb the impact of their own consequences was finally gone. I walked out of the restaurant and stepped onto the warm, brightly lit sidewalk of downtown Phoenix. The desert air felt incredibly crisp and clean in my lungs. I did not feel the loud, triumphant rush of a cinematic victory. I did not pump my fists or cheer. Instead, a profound, almost numb sense of pure, unadulterated relief washed over my entire body. It was a deep, quiet settling of my soul. I hailed a cab, climbed into the back seat, and watched the city lights blur past the window. I finally understood the absolute truth. The most perfect, devastating revenge is not about inflicting an equal amount of pain upon those who broke you. Perfect revenge is simply removing yourself completely, pulling your own strength out from underneath them, and letting their entire corrupted world collapse under the crushing weight of their own terrible choices. Thank you so much for listening to this story to the very end, and I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So, please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please do not forget to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.